morning, everyone, and welcome to Ohio EPA's Preparing a Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan webinar. My name is Helen Miller with Ohio EPA's Division of Environmental and Financial Assistance, and I will be moderating this morning's webinar. Our presenter today is Tamara Gerard. She is with our Office of Compliance Assistance and Pollution Prevention in our Northeast District office in Twinsburg. We also have Dan Bogolowski and Lynette Hublitzel from Ohio EPA's Division of Surface Water with us, working behind the scenes to answer questions submitted during today's presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to today's presenter, Tamara Gerard.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this morning on the Preparing a Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan for the Industrial Stormwater Permit. There we go. Oh, my apologies. Having some issues and moving the slides. Bear with me for 1 second. Could we advance that slide to the one previously, please? I'm having some issues on my end. There we go. Thank you. We're actually going to get started this morning with a poll to get an idea of who's in our audience and what your experience with the SWIP is. Again, my apologies. There we go. Thank you, everybody. So once the poll is launched, if you could please let us know what your SWIP experience is. Do you have experience with a SWIP? Do you not have any experience with a SWIP? Or are you sitting there saying, SWIP? What is a SWIP? Where do I start? So once the poll launches, please make your selections. Okay, thank you, Helen, and thank everybody who participated in the poll. So it looks like we have a mixed audience. Little more than half of you don't have you have experience in developing a SWIP. Some people are just getting started in the SWIP experience, and then there's a small percentage of you out there who are wondering, you want to start at the basics. What is a SWIP? So that's great, because I think in this session, sorry, again, I'm having difficulty advancing the slides. Okay, thank you. So this session, I think, is going to be great, whether you're just starting out in your SWIP journey or you already have your SWIP written and you're looking for ways to review and improve. So some of the things we'll be talking about, starting with the very basics. What is a SWIP? What's the purpose of the SWIP? What are some of the basic elements of the SWIP? Not only what are the elements, but we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into what each section of the SWIP is looking for, so the information you have to gather and how you put it all together in your written SWIP. We'll also give some really good tips on putting together a really good SWIP, as well as talk about some common mistakes that a lot of people make when putting their SWIP together or even when reviewing their SWIP. So again, whether you're just getting started or whether you're looking to review and update your SWIP, this will be a good session for everybody. Okay, so starting with the very basics, what is a SWIP? And if I had to explain what a SWIP is in the most basic way, I guess I would say a SWIP is essentially your facility's stormwater playbook. Because that's really, it tells the whole stormwater story of your facility, from, a good understanding of what your drainage structures are to how stormwater moves across your site, where it leaves your site at your outfall locations. As well as the activities and the operations that you do at your facility that can impact stormwater, as well as what are the control measures or best management practices that you either have in place or you plan to put in place to kind of control those impacts. And finally, your SWIP also includes information about how you're going to demonstrate compliance with your permit through your inspections, your monitoring, your sampling, and so forth. So it really is a really comprehensive stormwater playbook for your facility. And because that's what the SWIP is, if you're coming into the permit for the first time, you have to have all that information in place before you apply for the permit by submitting your notice of intent. So again, forcing you to pull all that information and really understand stormwater and its impacts and your controls before you apply for coverage under the permit. Now, with that being said, as some of you may be aware, we're currently getting ready for the next iteration of the industrial stormwater permit. And I believe the public comment section just closed in the last couple of weeks or so. So, in the very near future, the next iteration of the stormwater permit will be coming out. So If you're a facility and you currently have coverage under the current permit and you've written your SWIP already, you do not have to start from scratch. You have your SWIP written, and a new permit renewal does not indicate starting over with your SWIP. But what you do need to do is read through the new permit, read through your SWIP, and make any modifications or changes to your SWIP to make sure it complies and it's consistent with what the new permit requires. And you need to do that within 180 days from when the new permit becomes effective. But again, if you're coming into the permit for the first time, pull your SWIP together before you apply for the permit by submitting your notice of intent. Okay, so having a better understanding of what the SWIP is, you can see it really is a comprehensive and very facility-specific document, and it can seem very overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be. I find the best way is once you understand the components of the SWIP and you think about it, it kind of logically lays itself out in a way that makes it easy for you to write your SWIP. So what I have here is just an example. When I thought about what is the SWIP and what are the components of it and how it comes together, this to me is how it logically lays out. Starting with the planning and organization, which is pulling your team together, who's going to help you along your SWIP journey, to the assessment phase, which is pulling all that really facility-specific information together about your drainage structures, your stormwater, your control measures, your pollutants and things like that. Which then, and you'll see too as we go through how information gathered in previous sections helps you build or inform what you do in the next section. So once you have your information on your assessment, you then take that information and it helps you choose your best management practices or your control measures. And you can only do that when you really understand what's happening with stormwater at your site and what your pollutants are in different areas. And once you go through that, you're ready to put it all together. You're ready to implement your SWIP, implement your control measures, and then you're ready to show compliance with your permit through your evaluation, inspections, and monitoring. So this will be the general outline or flow that we'll follow this morning when we talk about each section of the SWIP and pulling it all together. But I think this is a nice way to organize it and make it a little bit more manageable as you go through and understand what's in a SWIP. Okay, starting with the planning and organization, the first step, which is really pulling your team together. Now, your SWIP team is very important. They're basically your boots on the ground. They're the ones that are helping you gather all this information and write your SWIP and evaluate your control measures. So you want to take time when you're putting your team together. And that really goes to understanding what the team is there for and what their functions are. And like I said, they're really helping you through this whole stormwater story and helping you evaluate your compliance with your permit, make any changes and updates to your SWIP and so forth. So pulling together a good team will make complying with the stormwater permit that much easier. Very important step. Some of the things you can consider when you're pulling your team together. Obviously, what happens in stormwater at your facility is going to be very specific to your facility, your operations, your conditions, your drainage, and so forth. And so the SWIP is very specific. So on your team, you want people, obviously, who are familiar with your facility, with its operations, with your stormwater, with your drainage, and so forth. And because the compliance happens on your site, you want people who are available and on site on a regular basis to help you implement your SWIP and control stormwater on your site. And obviously, as you go through and assign different tasks to the team, you want to make sure you have the right people doing the right tasks and make sure that they have the knowledge and skills that they need to understand what it is they need to do as part of the SWIP team and execute that appropriately to help you achieve compliance. So all these sections that we're going through today, they're parts of your SWIP that you need to get the information work out, but then they eventually get put in the written components as part of your written SWIP document. So when you're pulling together your written section of your SWIP that talks about your SWIP team, you obviously want to identify who your team is, the members' names, their titles. Very important to know what everybody's roles and responsibilities are on your SWIP team and make sure that you have their contact information. So this is just an example of how one facility pulled this information together in the written component of their SWIP. So you can see from here, and I've personally seen examples where somebody's SWIP team in their written SWIP is, I have a SWIP team, or my SWIP team is plant manager, night manager. Well, that's not really comprehensive, and that doesn't tell the story of who's on your team and what the responsibilities are and how to contact them. So in this example, you see we have the team members' names, their titles, both their work and their contact information given, and a real nice description of what their responsibilities are. So as we move through each section of the SWIP, my best advice to you is to think about each section, make it good enough that it can kind of stand on its own in some ways. So if somebody were to come in and they wanted information about your SWIP team, you could look at that and say, well, if an inspector came in and they had a question about a BMP or about an employee training, they would know on this facility, they're going to contact Dave Smith. So think about that level of detail as we work through the different sections of the SWIP. Common mistakes that facilities make in the SWIP team phase. They don't put together a SWIP team at all, or they put together a SWIP team and they don't clearly think out everybody's roles and responsibilities, and they don't assign all the stormwater permit roles and responsibilities to their team members. Or some facilities might have a SWIP team pulled together, but that's where they leave it. If those team members don't understand their roles, maybe they don't have adequate knowledge and training to do what it is they need to do. Very important, not only in the SWIP team section, but throughout the entire SWIP, to remember your SWIP is a living, breathing document. Please keep it up to date. For example, you don't want to have a SWIP that has a SWIP team member who retired 5 years ago. So if anything changes with your SWIP team, please remember to make those changes to your written SWIP document and keep it as a truly up-to-date, living, breathing document. And also, an important thing is, in order to be an effective SWIP team and to have an effective stormwater program, your team has to meet regularly. The permit does not have a minimum requirement for this. It should be, at a bare minimum, it should be at least once a year. But I can tell you, and I'm sure stormwater inspectors will tell you the same thing, facilities that have strong stormwater programs have teams that meet on a regular basis. Okay, so you've got your team together. Now it's time to really put everybody to work. So this assessment phase is where you're gathering all of your facility-specific information. So this is important, so please take your time on this, because this will inform the other parts of your SWIP and really help you in your stormwater compliance. So in the assessment phase, you're telling your complete stormwater story. Again, drainage structures, what are they? Where do they go? Where are your outfalls? Where are the locations where stormwater leaves your site? What are the things, the industrial activities and operations that are specific to your facility that can impact stormwater? What are the things that you're already doing that are stormwater controls? And things like that. So this is a really comprehensive section that needs to be, very specific to your facility. So it can be very overwhelming because it's a lot of information that you're pulling together. But again, I always recommend take advantage of resources and start with what you already have. So chances are you may already have information that can be really helpful in this assessment phase of pulling together the SWIP. For example, start with any existing mapping that you may have. Drainage maps, facility maps, they'll give you good information to help figure out what happens with drainage structures on your site and what happens with stormwater on your site. One of the best ways to get this information is by observation. Walk your site, make observations, view everything, and try to look at it through a fresh set of eyes to the extent that you can. And when you're walking your site and gathering this information, it's important to do it obviously during a storm event, because that's going to give you real good information. You're going to physically see where stormwater flows on your site. You're going to see, in many cases, where it leaves your site. You're also maybe going to see cases where you have some stormwater issues or some pollutant issues. For example, if you're doing an inspection or walk through near one of your outside fueling areas during a heavy rain and you see a sheen, that's a pretty good visual indication that you have some stormwater impacts there that you're going to have to address as part of this process. So those walkthroughs can be an invaluable source of information. It's also important to do a walkthrough during a dry weather when you're not in the middle of a storm event. And again, that'll help you see things that maybe you couldn't get a good feel for during a storm event. And the dry weather walkthrough is also really important when you're trying to assess whether you have any discharges leaving your site that are not stormwater. That's an important part of this assessment phase as well. So when you're going through and gathering all this information, and particularly when you're walking your site and making those observations, write down everything, observe everything. You can go and pull that information and edit it through later, but have a broad scope on this. And as you're going through, keep in mind you want to look for those areas of industrial activity at your facility, and also make note, are those areas of industrial activity, is there any exposure? Are there any conditions where those activities can be exposed to rainwater, snow melt, run-on, etc.? A good tip as you're going through this, particularly as you're walking your site and gathering that information, is if you have a portable GPS or even a compass map on your phone, it can be really helpful to take quick notes of locations. Okay, this is a material storage area. This is a fueling area. This might be a good location for a berm or whatever. That's going to make life so much easier when you're further down the process and putting together the narrative of your SWIP, and also going to be really helpful when you're pulling together your facility maps. Okay, so again, you're looking for, the stormwater permit is to control stormwater impacts from industrial activities at your facility. So you want to have a good idea of what those industrial activities are and whether they're exposed or not. So here's a couple just visual examples. In this case, in this particular image, we see some dumpsters or some waste storage. You can see in the two images on the left, they would not be considered exposed. Those dumpsters look like they're in great shape and they have permanent hard covers, hard lids on them. Whereas the two waste storage dumpsters on the right, they would be considered exposed, either because there's no cover, no hard cover on them, or because the dumpster itself is not in great shape. It's rusted, it's pitted, there's holes, it's leaking. Another example of material storage you can see in the image on the left. There is material storage. Yes, it happens outside. It is undercover and protected from contact with rain or snow melt. Whereas the image on the right, yes, it's under roof, open sides, but you can see the materials are spilling out, and you can also see based on the slope or topography in this particular facility that those materials would be subject to run on. So in a heavy storm event, very possible that rain could come in, run into underneath that structure and come into contact with those materials. So that would be considered exposed. And again, looking for industrial materials, industrial activities exposed to stormwater. So in the image on the left, we see an employee parking lot. So if that's what it truly is, just an employee parking lot, there's no material handling, there's no material storage, there's no industrial activities, that parking lot would not be considered an industrial activity under the permit. Whereas you see the image on the right, that is that's obviously some kind of plating or dipping operation. It most definitely is an industrial activity. However, it's occurring completely inside the building. There's no drainage structures or anything like that where that operation could come into contact with rain or snow melt. So that is an industrial activity, but it is not exposed. So just some good visuals to keep in mind as you go through your assessment process. Okay, so we talked about looking for assessing what happens to stormwater on your site. But it's just as important, and in fact, it's a permit requirement that you look for anything leaving your site that is not stormwater. Those are called non-stormwater discharges. And the dry weather walkthrough that I talked about previously is a good way to look for anything that's leaving your site that is not stormwater. So if you have anything that is leaving your site that is not stormwater and is not allowed under the permit, you either have to eliminate that discharge or you have to get a separate permit for it. In the sections of the permit itself, there is a list of activities of non-stormwater discharges that are allowed. So when you're doing your non-stormwater evaluation, take a quick run through of those allowed non-stormwater discharges. A couple things I can think of off the top of my head are fire response or firefighting activities, the water that would come from that, as well as landscaping. So those are two examples in the permit of things that are not stormwater but are allowed under the permit. So anything that is not on that list, that is a non-stormwater discharge leaving your facility, eliminate it or get a separate discharge permit from the Ohio EPA. So this non-stormwater discharge evaluation is an important part of the permit. It's required. Not only do you have to do it, but you have to document. Who did it? What kind of techniques did you do? What were your findings? Sign off on it. Keep that documentation with your SWIP. So I point this out because this is a very common violation under the industrial stormwater permit, is that people fail to do this non-stormwater evaluation. Okay, so you've gone through, you've looked at your industrial activities, but now you need to know how can those activities potentially impact stormwater on my site. So you want to drill down to what are the particular pollutants that are associated with those activities that can impact stormwater. Again, start from what you have. You're the expert on your site. Use all the information that you gathered during your walkthroughs, through your records review, through your maps review to help you, but also take advantage of really good resources that are out there. For example, the US EPA has a series of industrial stormwater fact sheets, and they're broken down by different industry type. So they're a really good resource because in a particular type of industry, you can see an example here for metal products fabrication. Not only do they give you a list of some common activities that are associated with that industry, but also the pollutants that may be typical associated with that activity. So again, use what you know at your facility, but please take advantage of good resources that are out there to help you with that. Okay, so again, everything you're gathering in these phases gets pulled together in your written SWIP document. And here is an example of how a auto salvage yard pulled some of that information together. So again, remember to, as you're writing, like I said before, to think about things, put enough information in that it can kind of stand on its own and somebody can get a good idea about that particular piece of your stormwater story just by looking at that section. But there's no need to include information just to make your document more impressive or flowery. So you kind of want to hit that sweet spot of descriptive enough to be effective, but not including information that doesn't need to be there. So in this example for the auto salvage yard, you can see that they talked about the different activities that they have. They talked about how those activities, can pollute the site, whether they're actually exposed to stormwater or not, which is important. And very important, you can see not only did they identify the pollutants, but they identified the outfalls or the drainage structures that can be impacted from those activities. That's crucial. So you want to make sure as you're going through this, not only you identify the activities and how it can pollute, but what outfall or what drainage structure could be impacted in that particular area. And another thing in this example, you see they always also pointed out their battery storage areas, which, yes, it's an industrial activity, but all those batteries are stored inside, so they're not exposed. So that is a stormwater control measure. So they included that in there as well, which is a good practice. Common mistakes people make when going through this assessment phase. Really, they don't give enough time to pull together the proper, comprehensive, facility-specific information. So you really want to take time and pulling together information and really understanding what's going on with stormwater and drainage and your activities at your facility. You want to make sure you have a solid understanding of your drainage and definitely a solid understanding of where your outfalls are. And don't forget to do your non-stormwater discharge evaluation, document that, and keep that with your SWIP. And that brings us to our second live poll. Once the poll launches, if you can indicate which steps can help you assess your facility: a thorough facility walkthrough, reviewing your facility and drainage maps, reviewing your past facility spills and releases, or all of the above. So once the poll opens, if you can please make your selections. Okay, so almost everybody said all of the above. Absolutely all of the above. Each one of those activities is important and effective. All of them will help you get the right comprehensive information for assessing your facility. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about SWIP maps. Now, the permit requires you to develop maps that go with your SWIP. You have to have a general location map, and you have to have facility maps. Now, you've heard me say it before, I'll probably say it through this whole presentation. Please take your time on this section as well. Your SWIP maps are more important than you think they are. And again, they should be pulled together enough that they can they're an excellent companion to your written SWIP, but your SWIP map should be good enough that they can kind of stand on their own. And I say that because when your SWIP team goes out and you're doing your inspections or you're doing your sampling or your monitoring, chances are they're not going to take out their 4-inch thick whole SWIP binder and trudge out to the field with that. They're probably going to take their field forms, their inspection forms, and their SWIP maps. And if your maps are good enough, that should be what they need for them to go out and do their job. Okay, so your maps, like everything else in the SWIP, need to be comprehensive and specific to your facility. Okay, you definitely want to make sure you're mapping out all your outfalls and your drainage areas, and that's where your previous walkthroughs and even your little GPS work come in handy when you're pulling together your maps. You want to make sure that you include all the relevant information on your maps. And again, your maps, like everything else in your SWIP, are a living, breathing document, so periodically review them and keep them up to date. So your maps can be kind of a little difficult, and a lot of facilities find this a little bit overwhelming to pull these maps together. But again, use the resources that are there to help you. In section 5.1.2 of the general permit, there's an actual list of things that are required to be on your facility maps. Again, start with what you know, use existing resources. Go to your drainage maps, go to your building drawings, go to any of that site-specific information that you already have, and see if that information is useful either as a base map for one of your maps or useful to pull information from and include on your SWIP maps. You can also take advantage of some outside resources to help you with this, such as the USGS mapping software that's available online. And also some of the county auditor's offices and county GIS offices have the abilities to print for you large engineer size maps, either using aerial photos as a base or other information as a base that can be helpful for you. Some of them may do free of charge, some may charge a nominal fee for those services. But again, it's a resource to check into, if you need some help in pulling some of the base information for your facility maps together. And some facilities choose to hire consultants to get a set of really nice, engineered drawings pulled together. So it's your personal preference and your skills and your comfort level. The permit does not require you to hire an engineering firm to draw your maps, but I know a lot of facilities choose to do that, so they get a good comprehensive set of, really good maps. And the other thing, as you're pulling together your maps based on your industrial sector, you may have specific things that the permit requires you to put in your maps. For example, you may be required to call out any, fueling areas or certain material storage areas on your map. Other sectors may be required to put together a separate drainage map showing facility specific information about drainage. So as you go through pulling together your SWIP, always go to your industrial sector requirements and see, is there anything else that's required for your particular sector and industry type? Okay, this is an example of a facility map. Now in this case, it's a very basic one. So this would probably be one of many maps that this facility would include in their SWIP. But you can see some basic information on here that kind of, tells part of their stormwater story. You can see where stormwater flows on the site. They have their outfalls identified, they have some of their drainage structures identified, and they have some of their industrial activities identified. So again, pull together maps that make sense for your facility, and know that you're probably going to need a series of maps to, show everything that you want to show and to have real useful information. That's part of your SWIP, and that's also, good resources for your sampling and inspection team to go out. But just one basic example of a facility map. Common mistakes facilities make when pulling together the maps. Like everything else, they don't take the time and the effort to pull together really good facility-specific comprehensive maps. Also, I've seen facilities try to cram everything into one 8.5 by 11 map. That's probably not going to be acceptable because it's not going to be legible or really usable. And it's certainly not going to be kind of a semi-standalone document that'll be helpful for your SWIP team. So just know that you're probably going to need a series of maps to show what you need to show. Doing maps, or at least some of them in color, if you have that ability, is also very helpful. It helps the pertinent information kind of pop out or be highlighted on your maps and makes them very usable. And have an understanding, again, of what needs to be on your maps. Go to that section of the SWIP, go to your industrial sector, make sure you're including information on your outfalls, your drainage structures. You also want to show your stormwater control measures. They should be on one of your maps. Housekeeping, anything that's pertinent related to stormwater is a good thing to have on some of your maps. And again, a lot of facilities will go through the effort and put the maps together, and that's where they stay. Remember, they're living, breathing documents. Your SWIP is a living, breathing document, and your maps should always be up to date. If anything changes at your facility, let's say, for example, you move some materials or activities inside, so it's no longer exposed. Change your maps. If you change some of your best management practices, added or took some away, make sure it's updated and reflected on your maps. And keep your maps with your SWIP. Okay, so at this stage, you've gone through and you've done a lot of the really intensive work of pulling all this information together and understanding your stormwater, understanding your pollutants, understanding how your activities kind of impact that. So now, again, seeing how the information builds on itself, you're going to take that information and that's going to help you select your stormwater control measures or your best management practices, otherwise known as BMPs. So selecting your control measures and your BMPs is a very facility-specific thing. One size definitely does not fit all when it comes to stormwater control measures, but there are some things to keep in mind as you enter this phase of your SWIP that will be helpful. First, think about and start with any preventative actions. For example, can you move those materials inside? If you have a bunch of old junked out equipment that's been sitting there for 20 years, it's a source of exposure, but it doesn't need to be in there. Can you send it out for scrap metal? Can you make any changes to your facility to reduce those or eliminate those exposures, Therefore, if the exposure is eliminated, you don't need a control measure for that particular activity. So always start with preventative actions first in terms of trying to eliminate a stormwater exposure situation. Also, is there anything that you can do to minimize runoff at your facility, therefore reducing your stormwater impact? So start there first. And again, go back to all that comprehensive information that you gathered in your assessment phase to help you answer those questions. When you're ready to select, your best management practices, your controls, put a lot of thought into this. If they're not going to be effective for the pollutants that you have, if they're not going to be effective or consider your stormwater flow or your drainage, they're just not going to be good BMPs, and you're going to have issues complying with your stormwater permit. So think through this and make sure that you have stormwater controls that make sense for your particular facility, stormwater, and pollutant situation. And you also want to make sure that they're feasible. You might have an excellent control measure that you've picked out, but if you don't have the physical space that's required to install it properly. Or if you don't have the funds to install it properly and maintain it properly, it is not going to be an effective stormwater control measure. So think through all of these things when you're trying to identify what kind of controls are you going to put in place for stormwater at your facility. And again, as I've said before, in this section, you also want to go and refer to your industrial sector, because there may be some industrial sector specific requirements for controls that you want to make sure you're aware of and you're complying with. Like everything else, your best management or stormwater controls information gets put together in the written SWIP document. So when you're putting together that narrative, obviously you want to describe the best management practices, stormwater controls that you have selected for your facility. Be descriptive enough so somebody understands what they are, and obviously where they're implemented, why they're implemented. Again, giving just enough information to be descriptive, but don't add information just for the sake of adding information. You also don't want to forget to talk about those real simple but effective control practices, such as good housekeeping, good maintenance, your spill prevention and response measures that you probably already have in place at your facility. They can be very effective stormwater control measures and best management practice. So please include those in your written narrative of your SWIP. And you also want to describe any erosion or sediment control measures that you've selected. And again, like everything else, remember to include this information on your facility maps. When your team is going out and doing inspections, they're looking at drainage, they're looking at outfalls, but they should also be looking at your control measures. Because again, if you have a control measure such as a berm or something else that's failed and nobody's taken a look at it in a while, you don't know it's failed, you're going to have potentially some stormwater issues at your facility. So make sure those controls are clear and outlined on your map and that your SWIP team knows what they are. Common mistakes that facilities make in the best management practice or control measures phase. Again, they don't think through this enough to understand and identify what control measures make sense for their pollutants, their flow, and what they can feasibly do. And I see a lot of facilities that don't translate those control measures to their written narrative of their SWIP or to their facility maps. And again, in order to be effective, your SWIP team or any other appropriate people need to know what your control measures are, how they're supposed to operate, where they are. So make sure everybody's informed and properly trained on your control measures. Okay, implementation. So you've gone through, you've done all this work. Now it's time really for boots on the ground. Now it's time to implement your control measures, implement your SWIP, and training your employees is a critical part of all of this. So a common question we get is, who do I have to train? Just my SWIP team? Definitely your SWIP team, but you need to be thinking beyond your SWIP team. So in addition to making sure your SWIP team members know everything about your stormwater story and your controls, you want to make sure that you're including anybody who's responsible or has any stormwater related duties at your facility. And make sure you include people that work in areas of industrial activity that are subject to the permit, or anybody that works in an area of control measure. So really widen out your thought on this and make sure you're including all the appropriate people in your training. Some things to think about when you're putting together your training. Obviously, as I said, pulling the right people in, making training that makes sense to what's going on at your facility. It's fine to talk about some basic stormwater control measures or basic stormwater topics. That's fantastic. But you should also make sure you're talking about things that are happening at your facility in terms of pollutant sources or in terms of controls that you've put in place. So make sure it's, you're touching on what is true for your facility. You're including the right information. And remember to train often. At a bare minimum, at least once a year. But again, facilities that have really strong stormwater programs train more often than that. And not only do you train, but you need to document. Who provided the training? What were the topics talked about? Who attended? What date was it provided? And things like that. And keep that training documentation with your SWIP. Some things just to point out, no matter what your training topic is, I think it's always a good idea to talk about those real, easy, simple, but effective things that can really make an impact on stormwater control. Good housekeeping, common sense practices, always good things to weave into your training. Common mistakes people make in their training. They don't train. They don't train enough, or they don't make training really make sense to what's going on at their facility. And also, I see a lot of facilities, they're doing everything right, but they don't keep up on their documentation. So they have no way to prove that that training happens. So please remember, keep up with your documentation in all of these phases and keep your documentation with your SWIP. Evaluation and monitoring. Okay, so this is where you're demonstrating your compliance with the permit. You've got everything in place. You've got your SWIP, you've got your control measures, you've got your team. Now you're demonstrating your compliance with the permit by putting all this together and doing your inspections, your monitoring, your sampling. Some things to keep in mind, obviously, this is where you're demonstrating your compliance. So you want to set everybody up for success. Do your homework. Know, again, that goes back to having a really good SWIP team. You want to know who's doing what. You want to have everything ready. You don't want to be trying to figure it out when you have your first storm event and you need to go out and collect a benchmark sample. You want to have everything ready and all your homework done in advance, and your team so well trained that you know a storm event's coming out. Everybody knows what they have to do. You have your bottles, you have your maps updated, you have everything to make their job easy. Okay, so that, and requires doing all that legwork and doing all that homework in advance. Make sure your team is properly trained. Again, you want to describe everything in your SWIP and make sure you're documenting everything. So when you're putting together this section of the SWIP, again, describe in enough detail what kind of inspections or monitoring you're subject to, how it's going to happen, when you're going to do it, who's going to do it, what kind of documentation are you keeping on it, and how are you maintaining that documentation. Here's an example of a facility SWIP where they're describing their benchmark monitoring. So again, they went into some level of detail, but this can kind of stand on its own a little bit if you wanted to know how they're doing their benchmark. They're identifying what outfalls are going to be sampled, what their sampling schedule is, who's going to do it, how they're going to do it, what pollutants they're looking for. So again, enough detail that it's clear what's going on with that monitoring. Common mistakes facilities make is they write their SWIP, they got their permit, and that's where it ends. You need to make sure that you're doing your inspections, your monitoring and sampling as the permit requires, and make sure you're documenting that. Make sure that you, for example, if you're subject to benchmark, don't just collect one sample and think you're done. Make sure you're meeting all those permit requirements. Make sure when you're going out and doing your inspections, you're also looking at your control measures, because in order to be effective, you want to make sure that they're still in place and they're doing what they need to do. And again, make sure you're documenting what you're doing, keeping it with your SWIP. I want to talk just real briefly, this will be the last topic, a little bit about SWIP availability and modifications. So again, you've heard me say your SWIP is a living, breathing document. Make sure you go back to it often. Don't write it and put it on the shelf and leave it there to get dusty. It's a living, breathing document. Review it regularly, update it regularly. Make sure when you first write your SWIP that it's signed, dated, and if you make any changes or modifications to your SWIP, you want to document those changes as well. Who did it, what date, keep that information with your SWIP. Make sure your SWIP is readily available, not only to your SWIP team, but any other appropriate personnel. It does you no good if you write it, leave it on a shelf, and it sits there and it's not available to anybody. That brings us to our last poll question. Okay, so once the poll launches, if you could let us know what you think are common SWIP violations: not having a written SWIP document, failing to review and modify the SWIP as needed, not sufficiently identifying your facility and drainage maps, or preparing them, not keeping documentation with your SWIP, or all of the above. Okay, so it looks like most everybody said all of the above, absolutely. And in fact, these are fairly common violations that stormwater inspectors will see at facilities. So hopefully through the course of this, we kind of pointed out those easy, those pitfalls and those violations that you can easily, avoid with just a little more knowledge of what's in the SWIP and what's involved. Okay, some key takeaways. Again, you've heard me say it throughout the presentation, but this is a lot of information to pull together. But really taking your time on each aspect of it is not only going to help you pull together a really good comprehensive SWIP, but it's going to make your compliance with the permit that much easier. So please, and hopefully that outline and that step-by-step process that I laid out, you'll find helpful and useful as you pull together this information. But please take the time to pull together good information and pull together a good SWIP. It can be overwhelming. Please take advantage of any resources that are out there, whether it's the US EPA fact sheets, whether it's the SWIP template that's available on our website, your facility maps, your facility spill control plans, anything that's already existing that's stormwater related. Use those resources. Take advantage. Don't reinvent the wheel on that. Some people feel they don't have enough time or enough expertise. Pull in help if needed. If you're in that camp, please pull in help. If you think you need help pulling your SWIP together. Please develop good maps. Your maps are extremely important, and they're definitely extremely important to your SWIP team and your inspection and sampling team. So make sure they're comprehensive, make sure they're up to date, and make sure they're living, breathing documents. Okay, review your SWIP regularly. Again, don't sit it on a shelf, and don't forget to keep all your documentation and keep it with your SWIP. So hopefully you've learned have some good takeaways here and some good common sense things that'll help you with your SWIP. I'm not going to go over these, but just let you know that they're available. There's several pages here in the presentation, which you should have a copy of as a handout of some of these resources that I talked about. So please scroll through them and make good use of this information. That'll help you in your SWIP. And now we'll open it up for some questions.
Okay, thank you, Tamara. We have lots of questions that have been coming in. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the question pane in your attendee control panel. And we've really tried to answer the questions as they come in, but if we haven't responded to your question during the presentation, we will follow up with you via email. So our first question is, Tamara, do I have to write a completely new SWIP when I renew my coverage under the new stormwater permit?
No, if you're covered under this current permit and you've already developed your SWIP, you do not have to start over. But what you do need to do is review the new permit, review your SWIP, and make any changes. For example, if there's additional requirements or anything that's changed, make sure that your SWIP meets those requirements and complies with the permit. So you don't have to start over, but you do need to review, make any necessary changes to your SWIP, and you need to do that within 180 days from the permit becoming the effective date of the permit. If you are stepping into this next iteration of the industrial stormwater permit for the first time, you have to start with your SWIP, because remember, that's telling your stormwater story. So if you have to have that story all figured out and put together before you say, yep, I'm ready to comply with this permit. So if you already have your SWIP, review it, update it. If you're new to the permit, start with your SWIP.
Okay, next question. Is there a minimum number of people that a SWIP team needs to have?
No, there isn't, and it's not prescriptive in the permit, and that's because every facility is different. So I think more important than the number of people is having the right people on your team. And, I spent some time talking about that, making sure that you have people that are on your site with some frequency, that have the basic knowledge and skills to, take on those roles, and that also that you've tried to match their skill set with their responsibilities. So for example, if you have somebody that's really organized and they're great with paperwork, maybe they're the person on your SWIP team that helps you keep all your revisions and helps make sure all the SWIP documentation is up to date. If you have somebody who's really loves being outside, loves walking the facility, has a basic knowledge of sampling. Maybe that's your SWIP team member that helps you with inspections and sampling. So it's not necessarily having, so many people on your team. It's having the right people on your team and making sure your team has the skills and the knowledge and the training to do what they need to do.
The next question, is the annual SWIP training only for my SWIP team?
No, it is not. And in fact, I encourage all of you to think beyond your SWIP team, because there's people at your facility that work in industrial areas. There's people at your facility that have some role in maybe your stormwater control measures or things like that. So chances are you need to include people outside of your SWIP team. So take time, again, when you're putting all this together, and think, who in any way has anything to do with stormwater at my site? Who in any way has anything to do with control measures on my site, sampling, whatever. So you should definitely be thinking beyond your SWIP team when you're putting together your training plan.
Okay, next question. Do I need to hire a professional engineer to prepare my SWIP maps?
You're not required to hire a professional engineer. A lot of facilities choose to do that because they don't have the technology, the capabilities, or the time to put together, those comprehensive maps. It really depends. Again, every facility is different. So it really depends on your comfort level and your, feasibility of putting those maps together. So I would say to you, put some thought into it, and whatever is the best way for you to pull together really comprehensive facility-specific maps, go with that route, whether it's, you feel you can tackle that yourself or you feel you need to hire a consultant for that. The main point is to have really good comprehensive SWIP maps developed.
Okay, just a couple last short questions here as we're getting close to our time. Does my SWIP have to be submitted to Ohio EPA for review and approval?
Not necessarily, unless it's requested by your stormwater inspector for, whatever reason. So your SWIP is your facility document. You definitely have to have it, develop it, keep it on your facility. You don't necessarily have to submit it for official approval unless asked. But if you do have a stormwater inspector come out, they definitely will review your SWIP.
Okay, and our last question, it's not always practical to keep the hard copy and the supporting documents with my SWIP. Can I keep these documents electronically?
Absolutely, and I'm finding that a lot of facilities are choosing to do that. The main point is that you have your SWIP and that it's readily accessible and available on site. And if electronic is the way you do it, then that's fine.
Great. Okay. Well, that's all the questions we have time for. Again, if we haven't answered your question, we will reach out to you via email. Thank you, Tamara, for the great presentation. Thank you, Dana and Lynette, for answering questions that were submitted. And I thank you to our behind-the-scenes team that helps us keep the webinars running smoothly. We'd also like to bring to your attention our Encouraging Environmental Excellence Award program, which recognizes entities for exceptional achievements in environmental stewardship. This program has different levels of recognition for organizations, communities, and schools. Please go to our website at the link on the slide to learn more about this program. And please join us for our next webinar sessions in March and April. As part of the Bureau of Workers' Comp Ohio Safety Congress, Ohio EPA will be hosting 4 environmental sessions. You'll be provided an overview of EPA's major program areas and learn strategies to comply with regulations. You'll be provided an in-depth look at your hazardous waste and air pollution requirements, and you'll hear from 3 senior inspectors from our air, wastewater, and hazardous waste programs on what to expect during an inspection. And with spring around the corner, you might have construction activities planned, so check out the session on NPDES construction stormwater. On April 5th, please join us for a webinar on our Water Resource Restoration Sponsorship Program. The WRSSP uses interest monies from our Water Pollution Control Loan Fund. The loan sponsor projects to fund preservation and restoration of aquatic habitat. And if you missed past webinars or would like to register for upcoming webinars, check out our new agency event calendar. On the next slide, please, you can register for upcoming, at the bottom of the slide, you can register for the upcoming DEFA webinars here. The events link is also on the web page footer at the bottom of each web page. If you missed past webinars or would like to register for upcoming webinars, you can also go to our DEFA web page, and that link is on the slide. If you click on the word training on the left-hand column menu, you can also find recordings of trainings on this web page. We also post our recordings to our agency YouTube channel. We'll post a recording of this webinar, usually within a week of the webinar on YouTube. We also include a PDF copy on YouTube of the PowerPoint slides with recording. And to receive notifications of upcoming webinars, you can go to our Ohio EPA Customer Support Center, create an account, and go to the Subscribe to Updates option. And there's a link at the bottom of the slide there. And the Customer Support Center link is also at the bottom footer of each of our web pages. And with that, we will end today's webinar. Thank you for joining us and have a great day.